Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of
the Super Data Brothers Super Show.
Which way is he? He's this way. He's this way.
I'm
Ryan.
I'm Eric.
And we are real-life brothers
who
work in the data and analytics industry. And we got a good one for you today, folks.
We sure do. You know, I'm so excited for today's show, Ryan, because today we're talking to Lindsay Murphy. She's the head of data at Secoda. She's the DBT expert. We're going to be talking all about DBT. For those of you know, a lot of you know DBT. Some of you probably don't know DBT that well. If you've heard of it, you don't really know what it is. We'll be going through that. We'll also be talking about being a data leader, becoming a data leader, all that stuff. So I think it should be a really interesting show.
Yeah, and fun fact, Lindsay is actually one of our most requested guests on the Super Data Show. So I have had people are constantly DMing me on LinkedIn saying, have this person on, have this person on, have this person on. And I have like tons of requests for Lindsay. So it's really exciting to have her back. She was part of our MDS Fest panel that we did in the summer. And it's great to have her on the show again. So before we bring her on, real quick, meet the Super Data Brothers. That's right. We exist in the real world, and you can meet us in person and maybe even get one of the coveted Super Data Brothers t-shirts. And so where are we going to be? I will be at IBM Tech Exchange. I'm doing a presentation, a panel discussion about data mesh in Barcelona next week on January 24th at the conference. And then we're also going to have a number of events. I can't even keep track of them all. There's like a happy hour you can attend that I'll be at. And there's a panel discussion outside of the conference that you'll be able to attend. So keep up on LinkedIn. You'll see all my stuff there. Of course, Day-to-Day Texas. Eric, what do we think about Day-to-Day Texas?
We think it's pretty cool.
Yes. This is the best one-day data conference, I think, in North America. It's awesome. There will be a ton of really cool people there. Megan Liu is going to be there. Matt Housley and Joe Reese will be there. Juan Secoda is going to be there. A ton of awesome people that you can meet. I love this conference. One day.
It's actually the first thing me and Ryan did as the Super Data Brothers. So we're like, hey, we've been talking about this for years. Let's do it. Okay. And so they went to Day-to-Day Texas, and there we were.
Yep. And then, of course, the Gartner Data and Analytics Summit in London, May 13th through 15th. I will be there. Good Data is sponsoring it. And of course, as VP of Product Strategy at Good Data, I'm going to be if you're in London, I think we're going to try to set up some kind of pub night or something surrounding this. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah. Oh, and if you are going to go to Day-to-Day Texas, use the code Super Data Brothers, all one word, caps. Yep. And I think you get like 20% off.
I think it's 20% off, but you better register fast because this is next weekend, folks.
Yeah, this is next weekend, so you better register.
Okay. So, I think last thing before we bring Lindsay on, give us a shout out. This is a live show, folks. And what does that mean? It means that it's more fun for us. It's more fun for you, and you get more out of it. If you get your questions into the chat, share your reactions in the chat. That is how this goes best. So let us know where you're watching from right now, and we'll shout you out. And then I'm sure Lindsay will. I know she's got a lot of thought-provoking stuff to say. So as she says it, let us know what questions you have.
Yeah, and if you have, whether you're a pro or a noob, if you have any newbie questions, feel free to ask them. That's fine.
We got a friend of the show, Mike Norris, tuning in from Ottawa. Good to have you here again, Mike. Mike is one of our true regulars. He's here like every episode. All right, I think that's enough. Hold
on. I got one. I have a clip for this week. All right, all right. So this clip, this is what it feels like to be on the data team. When users coming to you for requests.
May I ask you a question?
You can ask your questions later.
No, now. Now! Right now! I want to ask my questions now, and I want to have my answers now. You hear?
Yeah, so that's what it feels like to be on the data team trying to solve things, and sometimes that's what it feels like when users are coming to you with questions. So
absolutely. Does that guy kind of remind you of Gollum a little bit?
Yeah, kind of.
There's something Smeagol-esque about him.
I think that's Peter Lorre. If you ever watch old cartoons, he's like that goonish looking dude that they always parody that's talking like this.
Yeah, we've got Andre tuning in from Ukraine. Andre, good to have you here.
Yeah.
All right, let's bring get some love for the clip of the week from Miami, Florida. Yeah, it's cold here in Detroit, and
it's so cold in the D.
Yeah, it is so cold in the D. All right, let's bring Lindsay on. All right, enough with the
Yeah, all right.
wisecracks.
Oh, here's-
Lindsay, welcome to the
Hey.
show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So it's real warm where you are too, right?
It's not, unfortunately. I'm in Toronto, Canada, so it's probably just as cold, if not colder, as it is in Detroit.
Yeah, we're kind of sister cities in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
Cool. So welcome to the show. Like I said, we actually get a ton of requests for you to come on, so it's really exciting.
That's nice.
Yeah, yeah, we really do. So it's really nice to have you here. So why don't we start off by just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do today, and also kind of your journey to where you are in the data world.
Yeah, for sure. So I think you mentioned earlier, I'm the head of data at a company called Secoda. So I joined Secoda in May of last year. So I think it's been about 8 or 9 months already. And what does a head of data do? I think lots of people probably wonder. I'm a head of data team of one, I like to say. I think I stole that term from Julie Bainan from Census. So what that means is I wear a lot of different hats. I basically run a data function and a data team by myself, but I also do fun stuff like this. So I get out in the community and I do, different webinars and podcasts and things like that. And then I also get to give feedback on our products. So as a data person, I use our tool and I kind of understand, what's working, what features might we want to add, and speaking to our customers and things like that. So it's a pretty interesting role. Previous to Secoda, I had led data teams at a few different data startups in Toronto. So Maple and Benchside, which if no one's from Canada, they might not have heard of those before. Maple is a virtual healthcare company. So I got to, lead a team of data engineers. So analytics engineers. So working with the modern data stack and building out self-serve analytics products and things like that. And then previous to going into leadership roles, I was a data analyst for many years. So writing SQL myself, writing analyses, doing reports, all that fun stuff. So I've been in data for about 13 years now. So
Man, that's you and me both, actually. 13 years. Exactly.
Man.
Right on. Feels like a long time, but also feels like it's flown by.
Yeah. Let me hold on. I'm having an audio problem. There we go. I fixed it. Okay. I didn't catch that last thing you said, Lindsay. I apologize.
All good. Yeah, no, just saying it feels like it's flown by. I feel like the time feels like it goes by faster all the time. I don't know if that's a factor of getting older or the world that we live in, but even in the data world, it just feels like there's so much changing and so much happening that to stay on top of things is always like kind of intense. But yeah, I wouldn't want to be in any other industry.
I'm curious, so in that time, what do you think the biggest change has been over the last 13 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. I kind of try to reflect on this myself a lot, but I would say, like, obviously the modern data stack is a pretty big area that people are really focused in. Even that term I know is becoming a little bit like passe now. People are starting to not want to say that as much, but just this idea of like cloud computing and moving away from having to have like massive teams to build a data infrastructure. Like now me as one person, without like, I don't have an engineering background and I've learned a lot on the job and I can run a data stack by myself, which is like pretty wild compared to where we would have been, even like 5 or 10 years ago. I worked at a big pharmaceutical company for 2 years. And that was like, we had all of our on-prem data and it required like teams all across the world working together to build a dashboard. And the dashboard took like 2 years to build. And it's just kind of night and day. I'm sure pharmaceutical companies aren't quite onto the modern data stack yet, but yeah, when I compare what I could do in 2 years at that job versus what I can do in 2 years in the current day, it's definitely a very different picture.
Yeah, really, that has been a huge change. I agree. I can recall vividly when we had a new blade come in for our Oracle Exadata warehouse in the basement, and we all gathered around it in a cubicle at headquarters. Like,
Man.
It's like the suitcase in Pulp Fiction. Like there was a glow coming out of it and everything. It's
funny
very different.
It's funny because I'm at a university and we're just going to Exadata. So
you're now going to Exadata.
Yes.
So Eric will be adopting the modern data stack in 2030.
Yeah, there's some industries that are still really far behind. My husband's a lawyer, and it's another like law, education, and health are all the areas where there's still just like so far to go before. I showed him and his fantasy hockey buddies a Google Sheet and how they could like collaborate in the Google Sheet, and they were like, "Oh my god, this is amazing!"
Blew their mind.
Yeah.
That's funny. What does why don't you tell us a little bit about Secoda too? What do you guys do there?
Yeah, so Secoda stands, I like to kind of explain the name. Secoda stands for Searchable Company Data. A lot of folks kind of get confused about the name. We get Seconda a lot, so we make jokes about Wakanda, but it is Secoda. um, but it serves as an index for all of your company's data knowledge. So it's a tool that kind of integrates with all the different tools in your tech stack and then makes that searchable. You can document it through different features like a catalog, column level lineage. We've recently added monitoring, so you can actually monitor for data anomalies and things like that. So yeah, having lived in the world of not knowing what Secoda was and running a data team without a tool like Secoda, I now kind of have a very strong opinion that that tools like Secoda are really important to be able to effectively deliver things like self-serve analytics. Because if you're like Eric, what you showed earlier, the clip, it's like somebody wants something right now. And if you can give them the ability to self-serve that, that's great. But then if you don't also give them all the information of like, what does this data mean? Where does it come from? How is a certain thing defined? You're just going to get the same questions that you were getting before. So I think it's really hand in hand with shipping data products.
Yeah, I mean, it's the eternal struggle of the data team, right? Is like, how do we empower people? And selfishly, and at least in my experience, I always felt like, how can I get out of the business of someone coming to me and saying, hey, that bar chart, could that please be a line chart? And like non-value added stuff like that. We have a Seconda forever here in the chat.
Seconda forever. Also, Andre, Excel is dying.
You wish. That's a spicy take, right?
You wish.
Spicy take.
That's not Excel's not dying.
Yeah, I don't know if you have any strong feelings on that one, Lindsay. Do you think Excel is dying? Will it ever die? Should it die?
I mean, if you would have asked me that a couple of years ago, I've gone in and out of this. I think when there's one of those charts, the charts that show like the Venn diagram, and it's like people on the beginning side of things believe Excel is everything. And then on the other side, it's like Excel is good again. But in the middle, it's like people think that Excel should die and go away. Yeah. But the more experience you get, it's kind of that, I don't think spreadsheets or the ability to let people see the data and interact with the data is necessarily going to go away, whether that still lives in a spreadsheet or if there's a world where, LLMs replace that, like if you're able to talk to an LLM and have it interrogate the data, maybe you don't need a spreadsheet anymore. But I still think that ability for people to be able to see data and be able to actually see what they're interacting with is something that you don't really get as much out of other types of tools. So I don't know. I have come around on that argument a few times now. And I actually was just using Google Sheets and Excel for something the other day. It's the cockroach of data analysis.
It's true. I've had a similar journey, I think, to you in some ways. I spent the early part of my career really trying hard to get rid of Excel in my organization, not understanding why people are using it when this was back in the like OLAP Cube days, right? Well, we've got this OLAP Cube and why aren't people using that? And I've just come totally to the opposite position where it's like, yeah, Excel's never going to go away. What we should do as data people is learn how to support it so that the data that's in Excel is actually good and trustable, right? Because that's to me feels like the best option. And also, Wolfgang here shares Excel is the gateway drug for data enthusiasts. And I think that's actually an important point. People really do come to the data world. They discover they love it a lot of times because they get hired as an analyst somewhere and they're doing Excel work. And they realize this is the part of the job I really love.
Yeah. Good to see you, Wolfgang. Thanks for joining. Wolfgang was on my team at BenchSci. So, so we got a buddy. Yeah. And I agree. Like Excel it's kind of one of those things that like when you start out in data, like I was using Excel as my first data tool, and I don't think I would be where I was today without it. So I definitely agree with this comment. I also think that there's a difference between like really important things being in Excel. Like when you've got like a board report that's like, the numbers don't change, the calculations don't change, and people are still doing that in an Excel sheet. I think that is where you want to try to push people out of that. But I think this like prototyping solutions, like doing minor calculations, figuring things out and just doing an analysis in Excel, I think is still fine. It's just a matter of like, if the company's going to keep using this and you've got a robust like process to it and the calculations aren't going to change very often, you should bring that into your data stack and build something that's code managed code and it's version controlled and things like that. But I think it's when you've got all these Excel sheets littered all over the company and the data team doesn't know that any of them exist and everybody's calculating metrics in different ways. That's when it's a little too wild west for me.
Excel hell, as it's been called.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you think, I mean, let's say someone's in that situation where they've got that data scattered all over the place, exactly what you described. So much value is locked up in Excel spreadsheets. If you were on a data team that was facing that reality, do you have any advice for people? How do you start to get out of that?
Yeah, so this would be an exercise that we actually did when I was at my last company, Maple. We called it spreadsheet killing. So when the team kind of moved off of Metabase onto Looker, they wanted to kind of think about how could we, find all of these spreadsheets that people are using and bring all this into Looker and rebuild those assets. So really it just involved like going out and speaking to those stakeholders. So it does require some one-on-one time, and you want to go in and understand like what problem are they trying to solve. You don't really want to just say like, hey, we're going to take your spreadsheet away. But you kind of want to build a relationship and build a rapport of like, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? How manual is this process? How much time are you spending on this thing every month? And then you can start to kind of help them realize, if you let us take this over for you and you let us bring this into our process, like we can save you hours of time every month building this spreadsheet. And I think when you start having those conversations, people are pretty willing to give their spreadsheets up because a lot of times there is a lot of manual work involved, right? So we started actually measuring the value of that as well by like, what were the hours saved? So then it was really nice to be able to go back to our leadership team and kind of say like, look, here's all the resources and number of dollars that we've saved the company just by getting rid of all these spreadsheets. So I think that's probably what I would recommend, is just kind of some relationship building and then figuring out how you can really just help people save time.
Yeah, we've got a couple comments here. Madhav, good to see you again. So he says Excel showed the world of non-tech people the power of computers in the literal sense, and that's actually an interesting take on it. I've never thought of that before, but yes, that it is in many ways the gateway to the tech world is Excel. And then Chris says, it's not about the tool, but it's what you need from the tool. Excel's great with some risks, but it gives you what business users want from the data. So thanks for the comment there, Chris. Now, shifting gears a little bit away from Excel, one of the reasons I think we wanted to have you on, and we're so excited to talk to you, is for you to help us and our audience understand DBT. What is DBT? Where did it come from? And maybe who should learn it and what they can accomplish with it. So let's just kind of start with, say someone's never heard of DBT before. How would you describe it to someone?
Yeah. So DBT stands for Data Build Tool. And essentially the way I kind of like to describe it is it's kind of like a Python wrapper around SQL code. So in the sense that instead of having to write DDL commands where you're saying like create table or create view in your warehouse, you actually kind of hide all that behind DBT code. And all your team really has to do is write select statements. So if you can write SQL, you can probably figure out DBT. So it takes a lot of that, I would say more of the data engineering or the data architecture tasks off of data teams who maybe have SQL skills, but they might not have some of those more architecture-based skills. So that now you can build models instead of maybe using stored procedures in your data warehouse. You can build transformation models, they're called. The word model is a little maybe overused. So a model in this case is just a SQL file. And a DBT allows you to kind of create modular code and then to reuse those building blocks throughout the process so that you can build relatively complex data projects without having it be like super overwhelming. A couple other things that I really like about DBT is that, it allows you to version control your analytics code. So instead of having like everything just live as stored procedures and then somebody changes something and you don't have any idea who changed it or what happened, you can now check your DBT code into something like GitHub, and there's version control on that. And then there's also all these built-in data tests. So one issue that I had before I was using DBT was kind of like, I don't know how to figure out the underlying quality of my data. With DBT, you can add tests, which essentially are also just SQL queries, but they check for certain conditions. They check to make sure, are there any columns in this, values in this column that are null? Is this column fully unique? Things like that. There's obviously a lot more advanced tests. I just got off a feedback and demo actually that DBT put on about unit testing that they're launching in their next release. And so, yeah, it's been a pretty revolutionary tool, I would say, in terms of what data folks are able to do with it. And it really just kind of allows you to build out data products, things like self-serve analytics and other things like that.
And I noticed you talk a lot about code in that. So this is really kind of a code, it's code based, right? Like you're writing SQL and then this is helping you manage the SQL, deploy the SQL, maybe makes the SQL, modularizes it and makes it so that you can work off of smaller chunks to make it easier on you and that sort of thing. Is there, we have some people in the audience, I'm sure, who are more used to drag and drop pipeline builders and working with a GUI to do these sort of things. Does DBT have that, or is this really more of almost a software engineering approach to this sort of thing?
Yeah, it does try to be a bit more like software engineering. So that's a really good point, is that DBT's kind of philosophies around what analytics code could be is pulls a lot and draws a lot from software engineering. And so definitely the idea is kind of more code based. And so not really this drag and drop in terms of pipeline. DBT is an open source software first, and then they do have a cloud version as well. But even in the cloud version, you're writing SQL code. Yeah, so I would say that it's kind of given way to a new role which didn't really exist before DBT. They kind of coined this term called analytics engineering, and so that person does kind of spend their day writing code and testing code and basically, taking all the raw data and preparing it for the business to use, whatever that downstream use case may be. So yeah, I spend a lot more time writing SQL than I did in the beginning of my career. I wrote a lot of SQL, and then I didn't write SQL for like probably 6 or 7 years, and now I'm writing SQL every day again because I'm using DBT.
Yeah, it seems to have driven a huge resurgence in interest
Mhm.
in and usage of SQL in general. I think SQL is one of those things. Every 6 years, someone gets it in their head that it's going away, and it becomes a big marketing thing.
Everyone will use MapReduce.
Exactly, right. Everybody's just going to do MapReduce. Oh, we're moving everything to Python. SQL's going away, and yet it just lives on and on and on, and becomes more useful over time, if anything. So a couple comments or questions. So Shyam, apologies if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. He says, one of the primary points of DBT, it does the T in the ELT. So that's, if you're
Transformation.
making an ELT sandwich, the DBT is doing the T part of it. And then Andre has a question. So does DBT solve data quality problems?
It's a good question. I don't think any tool solves data quality problems for you. I think people have to solve those. But DBT can help notify you and help you understand data quality problems. So you would build data quality tests based on the assumptions that you have about your data. So DBT starts with building sources and staging models. And so building those at the first stage is really where you're sort of saying, like, I have a table in my warehouse, and these are all the assumptions that I have about that table. And I would build tests to test those assumptions. And then anytime that an assumption is broken, you would get notified with a test failure, and then you can determine what to do about that. So DBT is not really going to solve that for you necessarily. So maybe I'll just kind of like be on the nose a bit with like the wording there, but it does kind of help you understand whether you can trust the underlying data. And then unit testing, which I mentioned, which is DBT, they're working on that now. That is something that software engineers do. And that's more about testing the logic of your transformations and your models. So you're not testing the underlying data necessarily. You're testing to see, does my SQL code do what I expect it to do? So if I'm, doing some complex regex on an email to determine that an email is accurate, like, does that work if I give it some mock input data and compare that to like mock output data? So it's like a little bit more of an advanced testing methodology.
Yeah, and I think these things in general, like what you're describing, the fact that you can even do this sort of stuff compared to some of the drag and drop tools we've had in the past gives you the ability to solve data quality problems. Now it's on you to choose to do it, right?
Yeah, I think that's my favorite thing about DBT, and I will say maybe about DBT Core is the flexibility of it. Is it's just really extensible. There's a lot of packages that you can add. People are constantly, I think with an open source community like DBT has, there's just constantly people adding new things and trying new things. And so it's really, it's very rewarding to get involved in that and kind of see, being on the cutting edge of something that's kind of continually developing is pretty fun.
You used the term there, DBT Core. Maybe, I hope we're not stepping on a hornet's nest, but could you describe to us the DBT core versus cloud, what they are and why people choose one or the other?
Yeah, for sure. So DBT Core is what actually started. And DBT, just to give a little bit of history, DBT actually used to be called Fishtown Analytics. So they were a consulting company before they were a product company. And they were seeing this problem across a lot of the companies that they were working with was, they had built an internal tool to do this transformation logic in their consulting engagements. And eventually they kind of thought, this is a problem that a lot of companies are facing. Maybe we should open source this thing. And so they launched DBT Core. I can't remember the year now, but I think it maybe 2017. That's a guess, somewhere around there. But essentially from there, they started to build this open source tool. And then DBT Cloud came later on, which is a paid version of the tool, which essentially is just a product on top of the open source software that allows you to, do orchestration built into the tools. So you can, run automations and refreshes of your data. You don't have to build that yourself. And then there's a bunch of other features that they have that are built into the tool that make it just a little bit easier, maybe for folks who have a little bit less experience in, setting up open source software themselves. So yeah, I think the decision to go one way or the other really depends on your level of experience. So if you've, installed software before, if you're familiar and comfortable using open source software, then DBT Core might be accessible to you. If you haven't done that before, you might want to go more with the DBT Cloud. And I think it also depends on your pricing options, what your budget is, because there's obviously open source is free
Right.
to some extent. And then obviously cloud-based tools you have to pay for.
Yeah. We have a question here from Vahid. How do you manage DBT tests? It can become quite chaotic after some time. Are there any data visibility or quality frameworks in the modern data stack that you would recommend?
Yeah, this is a great question. I actually teach a course on DBT as well. It's launching next week. If anyone's interested, it's called Advanced DBT with Uplimit. But this is something that I talk a lot about in this course. Is this kind of idea of test bloat is kind of the name that I've heard people call it before. It's something that we were dealing with when I was at my last company. Was when you build models, you also build tests on them. And over time, the tests start to kind of balloon in the size. Like for every model, say you have an average of 10 tests or something. You start to get like exponential growth on your models every time you add, or on your tests every time you add a new model. And so that becomes pretty unwieldy. And the tests, as I said earlier, are SQL queries. So those do still have to run against your warehouse to be able to validate an outcome. And so that is really something to kind of keep an eye on. So this is a great question. Some of the recommendations and things that I have seen work is, test early and test often. There's something in DBT called the DAG, which stands for Directed Acyclic Graph. And it basically just tells DBT how all the models are interrelated and dependent on one another so that it can decide what order to run them in. So if you test at the source, which is really where DBT connects to the raw data in your warehouse, then you're kind of testing at that first step. And then my recommendation is, don't repeat tests downstream unless you've done some kind of transformation on that. So some common patterns I've seen is, you test in your source, you test in your staging layer, and then you test again in the next layer, the core layer. But maybe you didn't do any joins or transformations in the staging layer or the core layer. My argument would be, do you really need to test the same thing 3 times? Because if you trust that SQL works the way that SQL is supposed to work, then you're really just kind of redundantly testing things that aren't necessary. So I think it's just kind of adopting more, advanced testing conventions. And then I think not relying too much on assertion tests. So over at Datafold, which is another company in the modern data stack that focuses on something they call data diffing. They have quite a lot of really great blog posts about data tests, but they kind of think about how you break tests into 3 categories. So assertion tests are the main ones, which test an assumption that you have about your data. So those would be things like not null and unique. Data diffing, which is something that is unique to Datafold. So that's kind of like a code diff where if you build your model in development and then you have something in your production environment, you want to compare the output of those 2 things before you make changes in development to see, did this like revenue model that I have go from having like 100,000 rows to like having 10 rows? Like maybe something's wrong there. You might have made a mistake. So that's kind of that like code diffing example in a way. And then the last one is what I mentioned earlier, unit testing. And so some of these things scale better than others. Unit testing scales really well. Data diffing scales really well. Assertion tests don't scale very well. So I think it's just kind of, knowing the different tools that you have in your toolbox and making sure that you're using those for the right purposes.
That was an awesome answer. Thank you.
A long-winded one, but I think it's a long topic.
No, that was really good. Very thorough. So one of the questions someone might have is when they hear us talk about this is, it sounds like I'm running a lot of SQL on my cloud data warehouse. Is there a danger of kind of costs getting out of control? How do you recommend people manage that cloud DW spend when they're adopting DBT?
Yeah, this is definitely another big thing that I'm pretty passionate about is cost containment. Across the modern data stack, costs are kind of something that data teams, I think, really haven't been focused on enough over the last little while. And I think the modern data stack kind of evolved in this period where money was cheap and, companies were growing like crazy, tech was growing like crazy. And so not many data teams were getting these like really hard questions about budget. It was like, yeah, I'm going to throw up a cloud data warehouse and maybe I'm going to set up DBT and I'm just going to start running models. And someone from finance gave me a credit card and oops, now all of a sudden my cloud spend is like 10x what it was in the last month. And I don't really know what's going on. And I think because we're now in this environment where businesses are doing layoffs and we're getting really hard questions about impact, you're seeing data teams getting laid off for the first time in probably a long time. Like I know for the majority of my career, I've only heard about there not being enough data people. And it's always been relatively easy to get roles for data people. And I think that's changing now. So I think it's pretty important for data people to have that top of mind. So figuring out ways to measure your cost. So there's a company called Select, which is also based here in Toronto and also in the UK, but one of the founders is from Toronto. They focus on how to reduce your cloud spend in Snowflake. So they have an open source package called DBT Snowflake Monitoring. So that's one that I use to be able to tell down to a specific DBT query, how much did that actually cost me to run? And then I can go back and look at like who ran that against my warehouse, and I can start to hold different people accountable. No surprise, because I'm a data team of one, it's mostly me who's spending the money. But yeah, there are ways in DBT to make sure that you're being cognizant of what you're spending. So, if models start to get really large and complex, you can implement different what are called materializations. So folks who may not be familiar with DBT, but maybe more familiar with data warehousing or databases, it's like you might have a view or a table. DBT calls those different materializations. And they also have other options, something called an incremental model, which essentially allows you to just only process the new rows of a table or new or changed rows so that you're not just rebuilding a whole table every time you want to update something. So things like that can be ways to optimize your spend when you're building with DBT. But it is something I always kind of say, build yourself a cost monitoring dashboard if you can, and just keep an eye on that and then understand what goes into costs being driven up so that you can control it.
Yeah, that's great advice. I'm curious too. So say someone is watching this and they're interested in it. Maybe they want to learn it. You mentioned you're teaching a course coming up on advanced DBT. If someone's a beginner, what first steps would you encourage them to take to start to learn this sort of thing?
Yeah, so DBT does have some courses that they offer. So there are a couple courses on, I think it's called Learn with DBT or DBT Learn or something like that. But if you just go to their website, they do have some resources there that kind of give you the fundamentals of DBT. The problem is then, it's, unless you set up a sandbox environment, you're just watching videos and lectures. And so they do give you some insight into like how to get started and how to set that up. But I do recommend, if you're going to take a course, that might give you an opportunity to kind of learn a little bit more hands-on if you're looking to bring this into your day-to-day workflow. So there is a course that's kind of the prerequisite, I would say, to my advanced DBT course that's taught by Emily Hawkins, also from Uplimit, and that is called Analytics Engineering with DBT. So if you look up that one, that is a good place to get started. And I think the nice thing that Uplimit does is they kind of try to find the spot between like Coursera, where everything's like basically free. You can take things for super cheap and like no one finishes the courses. And it's very, I know I've signed up for like hundreds of Coursera's in my life and I don't think I've ever finished one of them. Versus like a boot camp, which is like super, super expensive. And, you're going to learn it really quickly, but you're going to pay a pretty penny. They try to be somewhere in the middle, which is like a little bit more affordable per course, but you still have cohort-based learning. You're learning with other people around you. So you can kind of go on the Slack channel and do all that and learn from each other. And then you get to work on hands-on projects. So I feel like when you're learning something like coding, a new skill like that, I think really being able to like get your hands on the keyboard and actually do something like a project is really helpful. Otherwise, I think you kind of lose it. So yeah, that's probably what I would recommend as a starting point.
Awesome. So we got a bunch of questions coming in here. So let me pull some of them up. Here's one from Madhav again. How do you suggest structuring data warehouse data using DBT or just in general, right? What sort of structures do you recommend and maybe what for?
Yeah, so we haven't talked too much yet about layers in DBT, but DBT kind of thinks about different environments, and then you also have data like modeling layers. So if we talk about environments first, it kind of still borrows from this idea of software engineering, where analytics people, we shouldn't just be like working in a production environment and making changes to our code base and just pushing that out and hoping for the best. We want to work in a development environment and test our code and make sure that everything works before we push it to production, very similar to software engineers. And so the way that you would set that up in your warehouse is depending on which tool you're using. Like I use Snowflake. I have 3 different databases, one for raw data where I just land my raw data using different ELT tools, like 5 terabyte Stitch, something like that. Or maybe you have your own method of getting data into the warehouse, but you land all your raw data in a raw data warehouse. And then you would have a development database or a development environment where people can basically just build their models into that environment. So you would, write your DBT model, run your DBT model, and that goes into that sandbox essentially. And then there's really no one externally, no data consumers are going to connect their data to that dev environment. So you can really do whatever you need to be able to test in there. And then once you've validated that your code is good, maybe through a peer code review process or continuous integration checks, you would then push that to production. And that is what the production environment, again, would be a separate database or maybe a separate schema that connects to all your reporting tools or your end use cases for your data. And so that's typically the setup.
And do you have, I know it feels like there's a resurgence of interest in more structured data models. Do you have any opinion on, okay, that consumption layer, should it be a star schema? Should you have purpose-built tables? Is it a mix of both? What do you think of that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a meaty discussion. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm still trying to figure this one out for myself because I'm actually, like I said, I'm building all things internally for Secoda. And so, kind of trying to build on dimensional modeling, but sometimes the data that you have, maybe it doesn't fit that structure as well, or there's certain things that you want to do that maybe that just doesn't feel as optimized. So I think it really depends. I know that's not a good answer, but I think doing any kind of modeling is important. Joe Reese, I know you've probably had him on the show before, maybe, but he talks about, even if you don't do data modeling, that's still a data model.
Right.
So I think,
right.
Data modeling is coming back in discussion a lot more. And I know Joe's doing a lot to, have, I think he's writing a book on it and doing some courses and things like that. So I'm definitely keeping my ears peeled to learn more about it. And I've taken courses on data modeling, but I am by no means an expert. So this is one that I think the jury's still out on what the best data modeling strategy is.
Yeah. And it's, then you start to get philosophical, like what does best mean for whom and in what situation, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Advice on ways to manage the proliferation of DBT models, as business requests flow in, does the number of models tend to rise and do you eventually reach a state of chaos? How do you handle that?
Yeah, so this is, I think, what happens, and I will be just right on the nose with this. When you don't have a tool like Secoda, this is what can happen because it can get really hard to like kind of wrap your arms around what's happening. Like within DBT, there is a documentation portion of the tool, which I didn't mention earlier, but you can sort of visualize and document your tools with it or your models within your DBT project. And so that DAG that I mentioned, the directed acyclic graph, is actually a visual thing that you can look at, which shows the lineage between all of your models. So there's, if anyone's interested, I encourage you to go watch the keynote from DBT Coalesce last year, which was just in October. Tristan spends a good amount of time talking about complexity and this problem of, proliferation of models, proliferation of complexity, and what happens when your project starts to get really big. They had this graph that they showed, I think, like at the last DBT or the last Coalesce in New Orleans, where they showed that like some of the users of DBT have over 5,000 models in their project, which is just crazy to think about. But even in my previous company, we had about 400 models, and that started to get a little bit unwieldy for certain things, and we were still a pretty small team. So it's definitely a risk. And I think where a tool like Secoda helps with this is that within DBT, you can see all of the dependencies in DBT, but then what you can't see is what is all the downstream usage of these end models that I have. So if you're using something like Looker or Tableau or a different BI tool, you can't basically see where those DBT models are used after the fact. And so a tool like Secoda allows you to see that connection all the way from your data warehouse through DBT and then onto your BI tool, so that you can then determine, which of these things are actually being used. So you can kind of sort by popularity. And then that gives you the ability to clean up things that aren't being used. And I think it just gives you a bit of a bigger picture of what's really going on. So you can kind of like wrap your arms around the system a little bit more. I think without having that, it just kind of does become this like chaotic thing where people just start adding models everywhere, and it doesn't become as governed, I guess, is maybe what's missing. So yeah, it's definitely a risk. And I do think you want to have some upfront thoughts about how you're going to manage that problem so that it doesn't get, unmanageable, which happens fast.
It's shocking to me how often data teams are operating with no data or insight into what's actually happening with the assets they're producing. It's and I don't know I don't know how you make decisions about even which of your projects were successful, if you're just kind of basing it on a vibe, like what felt successful. But a lot of people are operating that way.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm excited to see about, and what I'm pushing us at Secoda to build more features on is this kind of like metadata analytics, which is sort of like, how long does it take my DBT pipeline to run, and how is that changing over time, and which models are impacting that the most? If we can start to get more information about ourselves as a data team, then we can make more data-driven decisions on our own work, which I really don't think many teams are doing. There's definitely some out there that do that, but it's considered, I think, a more advanced thing, and it always ends up being this like, we'll build that when we get time, and it's after the fact. And so it just you never get around to it because you've got a million business people asking you for things.
All right. A couple more questions here. Keep them coming, folks. I think if there's something you want Lindsay to answer, or you want her thoughts on, I think you're dropping knowledge bombs on us right now. This is awesome. So keep it coming. So do you have any advice on the tactics for introducing DBT to a large data warehouse that already exists?
Yes, this is a good question. Yeah, so for a data warehouse that already exists, I think that's where you kind of end up in this migration phase. So basically, I think in that sense, I don't want to keep recommending my tool because it could be any tool, but I think having some sort of documentation or having some sort of idea of what exists in the old warehouse to be able to then move that over into your new warehouse is pretty critical. I've actually worked with some folks who are kind of going through this recently, and I think you need to be able to see what is the usage of the previous state, and how am I going to bring that into my new project in DBT. The other thing is that I don't think that you can really do a lift and shift. Like, I think a lot of times people just think, oh, I'm just going to bring all this code over. Like, we actually had a bit of a migration when I joined here. We were using DBT a little bit, but very, very minorly before I joined. And so a lot was built in Postgres. And so we had like really long, complex SQL queries that were building downstream reports and dashboards. And so I can't just like take that big, long, 1,800 lines of code and just bring that over. Like, I'm going to break that into smaller chunks and smaller reusable pieces. So I think that's where you want to think more about how you're going to then take on some of the paradigms that DBT uses. So yeah, I think having a documentation tool, I would sum it up, and then figuring out how can you break down some of the critical logic into modular pieces and bring that into DBT. Thousands of tables, it's going to be a big job. So you do want to think about what your migration timeline is, and just set some realistic expectations with the business about what that's going to look like, and the time investment and resource investment.
I'm curious, do you think there's a couple philosophies when it comes to just migrating complex systems in general? Sometimes I see people approach it from the perspective of taking a really important existing process or dashboard or whatever it is and migrating that into the new tool, versus the first thing you should do is build something new and valuable, like to get a win, and then you can migrate the old stuff. Do you have any opinion on which one of those is more successful?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I can't speak from experience because I haven't done a project like this myself. So,
Yeah.
but I would probably agree with you in saying that I think trying to get some small wins first is going to get the right level of buy-in. Like if you step away and try to do the whole thing all at once, and then you come back and you don't really have any learnings, it's not really like, I guess that's not really like an agile way of doing it. And so if we really think about data teams working more like software engineers, you want to try to do like the smallest piece of work that you can and then iterate on that and get some feedback. So yeah, I think I would agree with you, Ryan, on that one, is just try and get a small win and then get people bought into moving to that new process.
Uh, Another question here, suggestions regarding keeping stakeholders involved in data quality issues in general, but also using DBT. How can you work with them to get them uh, involved with it and helping support you in delivering high quality data?
Yeah, for sure. So there's opportunities in DBT to use things like the meta field tag. So in DBT, you have your SQL models, but then you also have YAML, which is essentially the configurations for your models, so that you can use that to determine documentation, tests, different meta information. And so with meta tags, you can add owners. And then using that, you can determine, if a test fails, maybe I might want to alert that person or that owner. And so I think there's different processes that you can set up to be able to say, like, who's the owner of this model, or who's the owner of this particular piece of data, and can I send that back to the consumer? And so setting up things like Slack alerts that go into particular channels for particular people, I think is a good way to notify. Maybe maybe it's a sales team who's responsible for what goes into Salesforce. Salesforce data is always notoriously a mess. And so if you can get your sales team to make sure that they're actually putting information in correctly, maybe you're exposing that data to them in a database so that they can see, like, a data quality database. That, I think, is a way that you can ensure that that person would then go in and fix something or address something that needs to be updated. So that's kind of some things that I've tried in the past, where it relies on a data producer to be able to update data, maybe in a SaaS tool or something like that. And then it kind of puts it right in front of their face so that they see, like, if I don't update this, then my reports are not accurate, basically.
Awesome. This is a big question. What does a successful transition from project-oriented central data team work to self-service analytics look like in your experience or opinion?
Yeah. Hey, Jenna, thanks for joining. Yeah. So this one was one, again, I didn't go through this transition necessarily myself at my last company, but they did before I joined, which was essentially moving from something like Metabase, where everything had to be built by the data team. It was all SQL queries and tiles, and then that was presented as static dashboards to end users. And that was an improvement from before, which was basically just like the engineering team was the data team, and they would pull SQL queries and things for the leadership team. So then moving to Metabase was a still a centralized data resource, and it was all project oriented. So then moving to the next phase is really probably the largest jump that you're going to do in an organization to drive data driven decision making. Probably the next big jump would be having a non-decentralized data team, having a decentralized data team. But moving from that, project based centralized work to self-serve would look something like, obviously you need to choose the right tool first. You need to then develop that tool out. So figuring out, what are the core data models and data entities that we need. And so you probably do need a pretty good data model at that point, or at least some kind of data model. Important documentation. So making sure that everything's documented so that people know, when I go in and I read this definition or this data, what does this mean and how do I understand that? And then training. So you need to train somebody on not just how to use the tool, but what does the data mean? How do they understand the data model? I think all of that is tremendously important to be able to then give somebody, the trust to be able to build their own data and get the right answers. And I think that is a continuous thing. So things that we were using at my last company was something we called a data clinic. And so we would have people come, if they had issues or they needed help. And so that we were kind of like available at least once a week for people to come and get support. So I think all of those things are important. I think probably the biggest one, maybe the elephant in the room, is having leadership buy-in and having a push for a data-driven culture, because you as a data team can do everything that I just said, but if the company isn't focused on using data to make decisions and it's not coming from the top down, then it's kind of like pushing a boulder up a hill, and people are still going to come back to you and be like, hey, can you build this dashboard for me?
Yeah. That is such an important piece of it, is getting the leadership buy-in. And Jenna, this is a great question, and thanks for asking it. I think this is one of those things. It's like the eternal struggle of the data team is how do we both manage this transition and also find the right level. I think it's different organizations have different capacities for really being kind of a decentralized, self-service data culture, and knowing how to get there and where there is a challenge. I think this is just a comment more than a question, but I've lived this many times over the course of my career. It's the good old love stories, which is data teams and migrations from one data warehouse for another, and Looker to Tableau and Tableau to Count, and it's it's just part of life when you work in data, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that is part of maybe the appeal of something like DBT, which I guess you do get locked into DBT. DBT doesn't have a lot of like competitors, but something like DBT Core, it is all just SQL code at the end of the day. So you could, theoretically, you could lift and shift that. If there could be aspects of Jinja and macros and things which we didn't talk about, which would make things a little more difficult to shift to another tool. But it is nice because I think if you can prevent ways of getting locked in to a tool like that, like with Looker, if you start building your whole semantic layer and your metrics layer in LookML, like you're stuck with LookML unless you want to reinvest your time in moving to something else. So I think that's where moving the metrics layer into YAML or back into your DBT project is really interesting. That's something that I'm looking at doing right now. I'm working with Lightdash so that I can just kind of like do all my metrics, and then I can, there's not really any logic that lives in Lightdash. It all lives in my DBT project.
Cool. Okay. So I think you just kind of ran the gauntlet of questions that people were dropping in the chat.
Lots of great questions.
Really? That was so cool. We got a hi, Greta Brower,
hey,
friend
Greta.
of the show, Greta Brower,
Hey,
saying
Greta.
hello. I do want to talk to you. We got about 8-10 minutes left. I want to be respectful of your time, but I do want to talk to you about your show. So you have just started your own show. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just started a podcast. It was just at the end of last year. So we have 4 episodes out now. It's called Women Lead Data. And so the idea behind this is I'm essentially trying to backwards engineer what it takes for more women and underrepresented groups to get into the data industry, and specifically at the leadership level. And the reason behind this podcast is, obviously there is some underrepresentation of these groups, but I've been in, like I said, I've been in data for 13 years. And this was always something that, earlier in my career, I would be, often the only woman on a data team. But throughout my career, I guess maybe the issue wasn't as pronounced. And maybe it's because I was often a team of one. But the more that I've gotten involved with networking, I run a data networking, a monthly meetup here in Toronto called the Toronto Modern Data Stack. And it's like 75% of the audience is usually men. And then I went to Snowflake Summit in July of last year. And I think that was the conference where I really realized, like, yes, there is an imbalance, but it's really pronounced when you start to get to more senior levels. And so I had been to Coalesce conference, and that I think attracts people who are a little bit earlier in their career for the most part. Snowflake Summit, on the other hand, is, a much bigger conference. It's a lot more expensive. It was in Vegas, of all places. And it's a lot more senior people. So, CEOs and C-levels of data companies and founders of data companies. And I was at a networking event in the evening, and I looked around, and actually it was my coworker who said, like, hey, there's like a lot of guys here. And as I looked around, I was like, oh my God, I'm like one of 5 women in a handful in a room full of hundreds of people. And so I think in that moment, it was kind of like this thing where I was like, oh my God, this is like really kind of shit. Excuse my language. But it was, it was just kind of like, I think one of those moments where it became like Vader Meinhof, where I'm like, now I can't stop seeing it. And it's sort of, yes, it's an obvious issue, and I've been in women in analytics, women in data, all these different types of groups for a long time. But I think what feels like was missing was this aspect of leadership, and how do we talk more about, why are there only 10% of CEOs and data companies are female, or why is there a drop off of leadership roles and gender representation when you get past like director level role? And then when you even look at like VC funding in the tech industry, or just VC funding in general, like 3% of VC funding goes to all female led companies every year. And so when you start digging into stats like that, it's really like there's something more going on here. So I really want to talk about that. So my goal is to highlight women who are in leadership roles, and leadership can mean many different things. So we've had CEOs on, I've had LinkedIn content creators on, I've had VC investors on. So I think I want to have, lots of different folks on to talk about this issue. But the idea is really like, what does leadership mean to you? What does your career path look like? How have you overcome different obstacles? And then also touching on social issues. So I think a lot of the reasons that we don't see more women in roles of leadership is because of a lot of societal expectations on us for different things. So I want to dig into, some of those spicier topics as well. And so, yeah, it's been great so far. And I would encourage anyone here to give it a listen and share with any women in your network.
Yeah, I think it's good work that you're doing. As I reflect over my career, it's easy to feel like there's been progress made, because when I started, it was like I started kind of in the IBM ecosystem. And, in 2010, if you went to an IBM conference, it was 100% men, it felt like. And it's not quite like that anymore. But I think you really highlight an important caveat, which is as you go up in companies, maybe there's more equity at the analyst level than there used to be. But as you go up, you get less and less of that, I think.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Like, what do we need to do here? Or what advice do you have for people that can help move the needle on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big problem, and I'm just starting to scratch the surface on it. But a few things that I am picking up from the folks that I've spoken to already is that, there's things within your control as someone, working in an underrepresented group, and there's things that are outside of your control. And so I think taking charge of what's in your control, which is your own, oftentimes your own barriers on yourself. So if you're not, maybe you're not asking for something that you want, or you're not speaking up for something that you want, or you don't believe that you can get there because you don't have enough role models to show you that it's possible. I think those are the areas where, like, push yourself, just go for things. If you have an idea for a company that you want to start and you haven't done it yet, like, give it a shot. If you have, if it's within your like capability financially and you can get funding and things like that, like, go for it. On the flip side, I think there are obviously systemic issues that hold women back in a lot of different ways. And so I think that's probably the larger piece that's harder to tease apart. So those would be things like, the different roles that women have to play. When I made a bit of a rant post a couple weeks ago, which was like, why don't we see more women as speakers at conferences? And I think that's probably one of the easiest problems to solve, is like, there's lots of amazing women out there who work in data. We should have more balanced speaker slots. And so someone actually replied and said, I haven't attended a conference since my children were born, because I can't travel and I can't go that far away from home. And so those are the types of things that I see. And I'm kind of like, I understand your decision and your choice behind that, but it does make me disappointed, because then, these conferences aren't as accessible to women potentially. But then I have the question of like, why not? Is there some way that you could make that work? Like, what's going on with the expectation that you have to be home? And of course, I don't know that particular person's situation, but
right.
But those are the things that I think we need to start talking about more as women. And there's lots I think that we'll be able to dig into in the show, which I'm excited to do.
Yeah, it's really cool. Last question related to this. I'm a male data leader, right? I'm an executive at a analytics vendor. What, other than the obvious, like, hire more women, dude, what advice do you have for men who are in leadership roles, who to help bring more equity to the distribution we see between, white men and underrepresented groups?
Yeah, it's a hard one. I think it's difficult, because I think folks can think that they're being allies and think that they are doing their best. And then there's still things that happen, women's ideas get taken credit for, or they get spoken over in meetings, or there's not space made for them. So I think it's really, highlighting women's work when you can, inviting people into the conversation, and just being able to speak up when I think you're seeing something that, doesn't feel like it's giving folks an equal chance. So I think it's a hard question to answer, but yeah, I would say just leaning into that as much as you can, and just asking women their opinions on things, I think is a really good place to start. So
yeah, it's cool. Yeah. Awesome. So where can people find the show?
Yeah, so we're on most of the podcast. I'm still figuring out. That's been one fun thing, is that I think I would encourage any data people to lean into some creative exercise, like, writing blog posts or doing presentations or having a podcast, because it's been pretty fun. Definitely a learning curve though, figuring out how to host it and do all those things. So it's definitely on Spotify and Apple Music. It's probably on a bunch of other channels that I don't know if people get podcasts there, but yeah, you do a quick search.
Cool. And then in general, if someone wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, feel free to add me to LinkedIn, and I try to answer as many DMs as I can there. It's starting to get a little bit unwieldy, but I do my best to at least respond. So feel free to add me and shoot me a message.
Cool. Awesome, Lindsay. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
It was
Thanks for having me.
Great show.
It was a real pleasure having you. We'll look forward to talking to you again soon, I'm sure. Take care.
I'll see you in Texas at Data Days.
That's right. You're going to
Data
Day.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll see you in Texas.
All right. See you there.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Man, is she awesome or what?
Yeah, that was a great show.
Yeah, it really was. That was a great audience, by the way. Thank you so much for the great
thanks everyone who
questions.
tuned in. Great questions. It's always better to have when people are participating.
If you joined late and you're wondering what does "we'll see you in Texas" mean, of course it means Data Day Texas, coming up on January 27th this month in Austin. This is the best one-day data conference you could go to, in my opinion. Great speakers will be there. Lindsay will be there. Joe Reese, Matt Housley, all sorts of amazing people that you're going to want to see. Use the code SuperDataBrothers, all one word, in order to get a discount on your registration. But obviously, you're going to have to register soon, because it's next Saturday, folks. And I think any last words to add before we let the people go, Eric?
No, I think you just about covered it. Just no outro video today because of rendering problems, but we've got some upcoming shows. So next week, data storytelling and card unboxing with Nicholas Kelly, and then Thursday we have Megan Liu. So we have some good shows coming up.
Yeah, you're not going to want to miss it. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. It's always a pleasure. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Catch us next week at the same time, 12 o'clock Eastern, every Thursday. Until then, I'm Ryan.
I'm Eric.
And we are the Super Data Brothers. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Do you like dags? Dags. What?
Yeah, dags.
Dags. Do you like dags?
Talked a lot about dags today, so that's the parting clip.
All right, take care, everybody.
All right,
Bye.
thanks, everyone. Bye.